Hello and welcome to the ID Talk podcast. I'm Alex Perella. I'm here with my co-host and esteemed colleague, Tony Bitsionis. Hello, Tony.
Hello, sir.
And today we're very grateful to be joined by Colm Gannon, the CEO of ICMEC Australia, or I believe he would say ICMEC Australia. Is that right, Colm?
That's right, Alex. Thank you.
Thank you for talking with us. So it's, this is going to cover a pretty serious subject. And I think the best way to start is probably just for you to explain what ICMEC is and what its mission is for any listeners who might not be familiar. And then we can get
Oh,
into like the overlap with technology and stuff like that.
thanks, Tony and Alex, for having me here. As you said, it's Colm Gannon's my name. I'm the CEO of ICMEC, which stands for the International Centre for Missing and Exploited Children. And I work in Australia, looking after a very recent organisation that's about 2.5, 3 years old. So the core functions of ICMEC Australia is we work with different stakeholders across government and private industry to seek ways to actually protect children, both online and in the real world environment, to prevent exploitation of children through both sexual and coercive behavior within online environments. So it's
And
all about child protection.
And it's ICMEC is a global organization, and then you're heading the Australian arm of it, right? And then how many other arms are there?
So we recently have Stephen Kavanagh, who's based in the UK. He has been appointed as the CEO for ICMEC Global. We have ICMEC US. We also have ICMEC Europe, and then we have ICMEC Asia, which is based in Singapore, ran and coordinated by a friend of mine who I've known for 14 years, actually,
Hmm.
Bindu Sharma. She is the person who actually brought me into ICMEC when I worked in law enforcement many, many moons ago.
Get into some of the questions that we have. Can you just like give us a brief just rundown on how you came into this line of work? Like what's your background and where'd you get your start?
Yeah, so I worked in on Garda Síochána, which is the Irish National Police Service, and I worked in organised crime. Basically, we're working in a technical area of that bureau. Then I moved over to New Zealand, brought over by New Zealand government, and I worked in the Digital Safety Directorate under the Department of Internal Affairs, which was to deal with protection and looking at objection material. So basically looking at child exploitation, harmful content online, and making sure we could enforce regulations and prosecutions on that. I worked in victim identification, worked in international and national operations for hosting of websites both on ClearNet and Darknet. And then I went into private industry, working within the AI machine learning with Rigor AI, an Irish company, even though I worked remotely from New Zealand. So I went full circle, left Ireland, came back to Ireland. Um, and while I worked in law enforcement, I was working with the International Centre with the Financial Coalition. So we used to do different types of investigations and would update financial industry partners on what we were seeing in relation to the commercialization of child sexual exploitation through live streaming, through pay-per-view, people making money actually off abuse of children. So that's how I started getting involved with ICMIC.
That's interesting that you worked with Garda in Ireland because they've been in the news lately for all the stuff with facial recognition. I can only like give a crude summary without my notes in front of me, but we have been reporting on it, and I know there were riots in Dublin, I believe, and elsewhere, and now there's this push to get facial recognition in the hands of police, and also, I believe, quite a heated debate about body cameras. Have you been following that?
Yeah, I have been following the what's happening with on Garda Síochána and also the look of using modernized technology.
Mm.
And obviously, there's going to be a very heated debate about using modern technology because people want to see what are the safeguards that are going to be put in place to protect the public interest, but at the same time maintain the civil responsibility, law and order within the actual country it's operating in.
Mhm. And I guess that's like pretty similar to ICMEC's relationship to facial recognition as well. Like it's you're looking for that balance.
So I think when we look at facial recognition, and we've seen so many times where it can be used for the right reasons, and it's been used to actually protect and identify victims of child sexual exploitation. Um, there is there is a need for it. It's like the debate we had when we looked at DNA. People were talking about DNA, saying this is very intrusive, and now it's become a standard. But the reason why it becomes a standard is because we put safeguards, we put protections in place to ensure that it's not going to be used in an overzealous manner.
Hmm. Yeah, we briefly touched upon this off camera, but it reminds me of a few years ago when the Clearview AI news was breaking, and it started off with like a big front page expose in the Times, and then over the course of the next several years, I guess, there were just, you know, case after case of different police forces all around the world, um, kind of being exposed as having signed deals with them, and not being totally forthright about the fact that they had done so. Can you just like speak a little bit to that and how that balance between the use of the technology, its utility, and then the privacy comes into play with what you guys do at ICMEC?
Yeah, I think when we look at Clearview is a really interesting case because one, it shows the ability for law enforcement to adapt quickly to new technology that's helping them to identify victims of child sexual exploitation. And when we look at these investigations, it's a very emotive subject to talk about. It can be quite hard for people to understand that there is children being sexually or subject to sexual exploitation every single day. Like I look at Australia, 1 in 4 children, according to the Australian Child Maltreatment Survey, has been subject or has been contacted for sexual purposes. That's 25% of the population of children. So it's in a very emotive subject for people to understand. And law enforcement are constantly looking for new ways and new tools to actually identify victims. When we look at Clearview, Clearview was presenting a solution to law enforcement and saying, this is a technology that we have developed. We have been able to scrape public images online, where then you can actually compare victims of child sexual exploitation against these public scrapings. Um, and when we look at this balance of privacy and this full disclosure, I think there has been a couple of mistakes that's happened in the past with law enforcement. They want to get the job done. They want to identify victims of child sexual exploitation, but sometimes the bureaucracy that allows them to be innovative and actually carry out the investigation causes frustration. And then they will say, well, I'm going to try this tool out, see what happens, and then maybe talk to my upper management after I have tried the tool out. And I think in many cases that has been the actual problem by both the privacy supervisory authorities in certain countries, by different cases that have happened within the courts. And then when they're looking for guarantees in relation to where the data is being stored or being accessed, especially data belong to victims that are being cross-matched, even though it's only a biometric number that's going to be sent as a comparison, it's still, when we look at facial recognition, we look at the actual vectors associated to face, that actually stays with a person for the rest of their life. So it is biometric data in its true essence. The same way when we look at DNA profiling, that DNA profiling, even though it's numbers, is still actually attributed to a person.
Mhm. I guess if I can be like devil's advocate a little bit on the playing the role of the cop, like
Mm.
how would you explain to a layperson what the stakes are with respect to privacy? Like if I'm uh a hard-nosed cop who doesn't care really, if I'm a Dirty Harry style cop and I'm like, I just want to stop the bad guys and rescue the kids, how do you explain that there needs to be this balance? How would you frame it?
So, being honest, law enforcement actually have a balance of privacy and understanding of privacy. They actually breach privacy continuously every day as part of their job. And how they breach privacy is when they execute a search warrant. They're actually given authority to go into a private residence and execute a search warrant. They know the regulations, they know the guardrails, they know the governance around a search warrant. But when we look at the actual level of child exploitation cases, if we look at the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children and the cyber tip reports, year on year, those reports are going up every single time. If I'm talking about 25% of children in Australia are subject to exploitation or advances in behaviours indicative of exploitation, you can understand is that we have an absolute tsunami of cases relating to child exploitation happening every day. Some of the investigators are dealing with a vast amount of investigations every day. Like their file load, their caseload is increasing time and time again. And what they're concerned about is to continued sexual abuse of victims. They need access to tools to safeguard those victims as quickly as possible so that they don't become a long-term commodity within these online offending communities. So what they're focusing on is the task at hand. Identify the child, identify the offender, safeguard the actual child, and hold the offender accountable.
Right. And then what's the response for why shouldn't they just be able to use a tool like Clearview if it reaches that end?
So going back into the actual idea of the search warrant, when they're actually looking to go into someone's private residence, what they need to do is they need to actually go in front of a judge, provide reasonable grounds to suspect that something has taken place, be subject to the questioning that's in front of the courts, and then being authorized to use a search warrant to go into the private residence. The same way when we look at using Clearview is that there's a governance, there's some sort of oversight taking place, that the social license that they have to actually protect children is also being governed. So they're not using it as a tool to actually look for a vector ID of their partner or the person they're in a relationship with. How do we actually have stopgaps in place? Now, I know the people that are actually investigating child sexual abuse material, the victim ID specialists across Australia and even across the world, and they have the utmost integrity. But the only thing is, because I know them, the rest of the community doesn't know them. So what safeguards does that community have? Which means there needs to be an independent supervisory authority that can actually say, yes, we should be using this tool, but it should be used in certain restraints. Only victim ID people use it. The data is maintained in a jurisdiction which we control. That the information is constantly being audited so that I can go out and say to the people who have given the social license to law enforcement, yes, they are operating within the law. Yes, they are protecting children. And yes, they're doing this for the interests of society.
Yeah. So you're basically just arguing for rules. Like there have to be rules for how the tech is used, which I mean, I think probably everyone can agree on.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is that when you're looking at say Clearview, and I know Clearview has certain standards and certain regulations and certain things put in place, but ultimately Clearview is a commercial organization. It's a commercial entity based outside of the jurisdiction of Australia. So what guarantees do we have in relation to that Clearview is not going to be subject to a commercial takeover? What guarantees do we have that certain data is not being distributed for other commercial gains? Because I mean, the tool Clearview, as part of their moral standing, will provide this tool free of charge to law enforcement. There has to be questions in relation to where's the investment coming from in relation to this tool. How do we ensure that this tool is going to be always brought in and always being maintained in a way that has integrity? If we look at the CAP AI framework, which was brought out by Oxford University, one of the biggest problems and one of the biggest concerns we have is that when we bring technology into play, what is the retirement process for that technology when it no longer becomes viable, when it no longer becomes accessible to the end user? What happens with the information that's being used to actually train that technology? What happens to the information that's being used to actually check against that technology? And also, what happens to the customer who's using that technology and becomes dependent on it? What is the
Mhm.
retirement process of that technology? How is the process going to change the investigative process for victim ID people? So there's a lot of questions that need to be asked in relation to this. Um, I think Clearview and actually that technology is really, really important. But what's also important is the use of governance, the use of legislative instruments, uh, the way that information is gathered.
Mhm.
When you're doing scraping of public profiles, and I know there's been decisions by the courts, definitely within the Court of Justice in the European Union, talking about virtual public spaces. And I think, yeah, okay, it's virtual public spaces. That information is being scraped on online. The difficulty is that the information that's been cross-referenced is not from public spaces. It's from
Mhm.
online offending communities. It's coming into investigations. There has to be protection. There has to be rights to victims under the UN Convention for Rights of Children. The OPS2 protocol is that when I'm investigating something, I need to have a victim-centric approach. Yes, identifying them is important, but it's also how do I make sure their information is not being leaked?
Yeah. What like do you feel like you're seeing signs that things are trending in the right direction with regards to things like oversight and kind of the um, move towards more use of different kind of identification technologies, but also the balance that you're talking about? Is it because we write about it, we read about it, and over the past few years, it's definitely evident that it's become more and more common for police forces to adopt different forms of biometric and identity technology and to establish some sort of set of rules specific to what they're using. But overall, with your through your work with ICMEC, are you seeing things trending in a direction that makes you feel okay? This could be, you know, good for the overall goal.
Yeah, I think there's a level of maturity coming in from a number of facets within the actual environment. So the level of maturity when we're looking at technology developers, clearly identifying what their intent of the technology is, and also working within regulatory frameworks. I mean, the AI Act brought in an awful lot of ways to actually make sure that you're building something that's ethically, legally, and technically robust. There's also where you look at governments, and governments have actually suddenly become more impressed with actually being able to deploy AI. They're still grappling with how they're actually going to deploy AI, and they're also grappling with data sovereignty. How do we make sure that the data stays within our jurisdiction, within our control? But they understand that they need to start advancing with technology, both within their processes and also within their legislative frameworks. When I look at law enforcement have been able to adapt to technology very, very quickly when they're allowed to actually do that. So when we're looking at specialists in the area of child exploitation, they adapt so quickly when it comes to technology. Sometimes like a racehorse, you need to just hold the reins a little bit and say, hold on, we just need to slow down because the regulation hasn't caught up with us. And the bureaucracy, unfortunately, hasn't caught up with us. So we just need to hold the reins a little bit before we can actually go really quickly. So law enforcement are eager to try new technology, new ways of doing things. And they just need to actually make sure that when they're actually trying those different technologies, is that we have the supervisory authorities on board, and that we have the governance structure in place. And more importantly, is that we have the governments willing to invest in the use of that technology, because with that investment becomes additional innovation that happens at the technology end, and you're actually spurring on capability being increased time and time again to ensure that the social license of protecting children is being reinforced, and also the balance of privacy has been considered.
Does ICMEC work directly with tech companies? I don't know if yes, I'd be curious who, or maybe you can't name them, but do you have like working relationships directly with them?
So we engage with all stakeholders looking at ways to basically make protection of children both online and offline a center core. So we look at safety by design. So when we engage with tech industry partners, we will engage with them in a meaningful and constructive way in relation to child protection policies.
Okay.
That's a really good answer, isn't it, Alex? It's right. It's like I'm standing on a political stage now.
Um, I guess, yeah, you probably don't want to get into what specific algorithms are working best or anything, but let me ask you this. Are there technological approaches that you see as more promising? For example, I remember writing, I think we've covered a little bit of police using hashing technology that would somehow obscure the faces of victims to like human viewers, but the system knows who it is and can do the matching. And anything like that, or other technological approaches that you think are very promising.
I think sometimes we have to take a different balance when we're looking at the total stack within the technology approaches. Like we can talk about crypto hashing, we can talk about fuzzy hashing, we can talk about even simple things of deterrence messaging that happens on platforms. I mean, we're working hard with technology service providers to make sure that those deterrence messaging for onset or potential offenders is actually being put front and center. So when they're looking for child sexual abuse material, is that they get a deterrence message to say what you're looking for is harmful for yourself and others. When we're looking at crypto hashing, it's actually interesting that you're talking about crypto hashing and hashing algorithms, because there's a recent article actually published in the IEEE Security and Privacy Journal that talked about the likes of photo DNA brought out by Microsoft. It's not a foolproof technique. It's a fuzzy hash. Of course, it's not going to give a perfect match all the time, but it's based on probability. So what I would say is that when we're looking at the different technologies and blurring facial images, investigators aren't really concerned about the ability to actually hide the information. They want to make sure they have access to the information, that they have control of the information, and they have access to software capabilities that leads them to actually identify a victim of child sexual abuse. If they had an instance of Clearview sitting in their premise and being able to actually bounce off that, and not having any information going out into the wider internet service provider, that's what I would call the gold standard. And I think that's what industry and governments need to be looking at, is how do we get the tools into the hands of the investigators that balance privacy, but also allows them to be expeditious in the safeguarding of victims of child sexual abuse. So on-premise tools is the best way forward, absolutely, or tools that are actually controlled within the sovereignty of a country.
Do you ever see that? Like, do you see this gold standard ever in practice?
So yeah, I've definitely seen this gold standard in practice. My previous role was where I worked with the Rigor AI team in AI and machine learning, and the whole practice was to make sure that we had on-premise tools with law enforcement. So the tool that was supported by the Internal Security Fund with the European Union, called the Erica project, that allowed us to actually develop capability for law enforcement for risk assessment of child sexual abuse offending communities online. And what's happened with that, it's continuously being developed so that it actually is an on-premise tool, so they don't have to worry about any data breaches or any investigative tradecraft being released. They can just actually use it within their environments.
That's encouraging.
Yeah.
Uh, are so I like so far you're talking a lot about cooperation between all these different stakeholders, which is great. But then I'm also curious if there's like bottlenecks or obstacles that you continuously come up against where you're like, this is just not helping at all. This doesn't help anyone. Like what are those challenges that need to just be solved?
I think the biggest thing we see with challenges is we see intent of legislation versus the operation of legislation. And so I think a really good example is when we look at the Digital Services Act, where we talked about algorithms and algorithm auditing, and also making sure that we have the very large online providers, the VLOPs, actually being able to make these disclosures. But what was absent was the operational guides that need to be brought in as part of that legislation. So we have things like recitals that come in, AI Act is really good when we look at the recitals compared to each article of that new piece of legislation. That's always a bottleneck because you have the written legislation, the intent of the legislation, and then the interpretation of the legislation. And that actually creates massive conflict, not even conflict in relation to a country, but also within the same organization. Like when people say that's private information, you're kind of going, well, actually, it's not exempt as private information. And then you have this conflict between two different departments. That's where you need to have these authorization codes or understanding and regulations. It's not enough just to say we're putting legislation in place. How is it going to work?
Yeah, it needs to be clear. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah.
And less confusing.
Tony and I heard from someone, this is kind of like third party, somebody who works with law enforcement, a vendor, got in touch with us. I think he was conveying frustration with the AI Act on the part of his law enforcement friends. And I think it was about exactly that. I think it was ambiguity. Tony, you might remember what I'm talking about. This was in an email. Um, and yeah, it sounded like he was like, no one knows what's going on. Um, but you did say earlier that it sounds like there's things that the AI Act is getting right. So I don't know. I'm curious specifically what you think it's doing really well, and then like what do you think about this idea that it's confusing people in law enforcement?
So I think what it's doing really well, it's actually identifying what unacceptable AI is, what
Hmm.
high risk AI is, and also putting special exemptions in relation to unacceptable risk AI. So a good example is Article 5 1D, where it talks about social profiling. And the reason why I know about this article is because I spent so much time when I was working on the Erica project to actually deal with this piece of social profiling because I was developing a risk score with it. Well, the team was developing, I was involved in the ethics, the risk score of child sexual abuse offenders. That is social profiling in its essence. You're saying that this person presents a higher risk than anybody else. The AI Act puts special exemptions in. The last three lines of that subsection says, unless it's independently verified that this person's involved in a criminal network or criminal enterprise, I think is what the Act calls it. When you're looking at online child sexual offending, that is a criminal enterprise, which means that we could actually use an unacceptable, under the Act, unacceptable risk based on this three-line exemption being put in place.
Hmm.
So I think there are certain things where you're kind of going, oh, this is actually taking a more social view of legislation in relation to harms versus innovation. So they still want to encourage innovation, but they don't want harms to be actually extended to general populace, but they want to be used for the greater good. Some of
Hmm.
the other things that I find very frustrating with the AI Act, and I think it's going to take time for it to be implemented, is when we look at the European AI advisory board and you talk to supervisory authorities and going, oh, we'd like to actually make a submission to the European AI advisory board to actually let them see what we're doing. They're going, that's great. Difficulty is that hasn't been set up, that hasn't actually come into play. They're kind of going, but the act was brought in the 1st of August 2024. You're asking us to adhere to the act. But when we want to actually take it a step further and show what we're doing and seek advice in relation to how we're developing AI tools, because we want to follow all the regulations, we go to a door, knock on it, and go, we need help, and the door is locked. And there's
Hmm.
actually nobody in the house, and you're kind of going, well, you brought in the legislation. Why isn't there actual the support that comes with that legislation to allow us to actually adhere to the regulations?
Hmm.
So that's some of the problems that we have. And I know it's going to take a good couple of years for the actual full legislation, the regulations to come into play. But if you're talking about it and singing praises about the first piece of regulation that's coming in play in relation to dealing with I think you should have the pathway totally clear so that we can actually move forward and progress really, really quickly. Because technology doesn't stumble.
Hmm.
Advances in technology don't change. They don't slow down. It's getting faster and faster. When we look at Moore's law in relation to what we talked about, data storage and size, that's blown out of the window years ago. So when we're looking at AI and we're looking at machine learning, it's changing every 3 months. It's changing every 6 weeks. It's going fast. And you're asking us to use regulations that have no support or operational um, capability for us to actually develop things. So I think what we need to do as a society is when we bring legislation in, especially acts like the AI Act, is that we add regulation, interpretation, and support for those actual pieces of law.
Yeah, so you sort of kind of answered what my question was going to be there, but yeah, I was just going to say, what what do you where's your majority of your energy going to these days? Like, I know it's oversimplifying things to ask you what's the one thing that can happen that can really help your cause the most right now, because it's a number of interconnected and complex issues, tons of stakeholders, local, regional, blah blah blah, all these governments. But I guess what are you focusing the majority of your energy on? Or maybe to put it a little simpler, what would be like the one thing, if you could distill it down to one thing that you would want us to take away from this conversation with regards to where you're going now?
I think the biggest thing that we're facing at the moment is where privacy is not protecting the right people. And that's the biggest thing that we're actually finding time and time again. There's organizations that can actually see trends in relation to online offending and criminal activity, but they're not allowed to share that information because the privacy acts or the privacy regulations in the country they operate in. It's one of the biggest things we have at the moment in Australia, and there is changes afoot, but they can't exchange it on a one-to-one basis and go, by the way, we see this person is actually procuring material which we believe to be child sexual abuse material. Here is their phone number, here's their account details, here is their name. They can't do that because the privacy regulations in their current format doesn't allow that to take place. So what's happened is that the Privacy Act is protecting criminal enterprise, but not protecting the victims of child sexual exploitation. And it's a big frustration, not just amongst us as a not-for-profit organization, but also it's a big frustration when we look at our private stakeholders and also our law enforcement government partners. Is they're kind of going, is the Privacy Act actually fit for purpose? There has to be a stage where you talk about the balance of rights and where you have a break the glass moment, kind of going, this is urgent. The regulations are going to say that I can't do it, but I need to do it because there's an immediate danger to a child, or there is belief, a genuine belief that there is actually a child at risk.
And just to be clear, that Privacy Act you mentioned is Australian legislation, right?
Yeah, it's so this is the great thing is that when we look at Australian legislation, it's very much modeled on other democratic societies' privacy regulations, and it's quite similar. It's similar to the Irish Privacy Act. It's similar to the European GDPR privacy regulations. It's the same frustration is not just felt in Australia; it's felt all over the world where privacy regulations are kind of going, who are you actually protecting in this instance?
Mm.
Why don't we have these types of boards that sit there and kind of go, yeah, we believe that this was actually done correctly and the privacy was an immediate exchange. Even talking to supervisory authorities, there's not enough investment from governments to allow them to actually supervise these small exchanges that are taking place because they're dealing with massive investigations of breach of privacies or privacy leaks. They don't have enough resources there. They don't even have enough resources within law enforcement to actually deal with certain amounts of cases. But what I would say is that when we look at the privacy regulations, it's something that governments need to start realistically assessing who are they protecting when they're actually looking at the Privacy Act.
And you said there are signs that something is being done about this, like they're addressing this issue.
Yeah, in Australia, what they're trying to do, the government is trying to do is actually have a one-to-one privacy exchange, where there's not going to be a breach of the act. However, that's great when you have a point-to-point, like an organization to organization. But when we look at child exploitation, that organization is not just the only one who's receiving the information. The organization receiving the information is not the only one that's experienced the pain from the same offender or from the same location or communities. What we need to do is we need to have a way to actually exchange it to a number of different organizations at the same time so that we can actually curtail the risk, curtail the abuse towards a child or exploitation of a child. And it's not even just to do with child exploitation, it's also to deal with people who are actually subject to scams, people who are subject to actual adverse behavior from criminal enterprise, whether it's to do with terrorism, whether it's to do with fraud, whether it's to do with underground banking. is that they're able to actually deal with that as quickly as possible. So I think there is a change. There is that maturity, as we talked about earlier on, in relation to legislation changing and people actually suddenly understanding what the social needs are within the online space. Um, but it takes time, and it takes a bit of time to actually some people to grow up and actually understand what legislation needs to be looked at.
Mhm. I mean, that's encouraging in a way, to a degree, I guess I would say. But yeah, I'm also curious because of the way you're talking about the the crime and the people who know information and are unable to share it. Is it how much of it is organized? Like, I mean, the crime. Because I feel like a lot of media representations of child exploitation are like it's some creep and he's like in a basement in his house and the police like raid it or whatever. But then, in recent years we've had these like explosive stories like the Epstein case where that was highly
Mm.
organized. So yeah, I'm curious, like you're an expert and so I'm curious like how much of it do you think actually is just criminal organizations, enterprises?
It is criminal enterprises. It absolutely is. And there's what we call ad hoc criminal enterprises and then dead set organized criminal enterprises. So when we look at ad hoc, it means people coming together and then just committing crimes on a casual basis. So people don't realize how organized when we look at child exploitation, how organized it actually is. We have micro uh, economic areas being created for digital live trafficking. So when I look at child trafficking, people talk about, oh, well, you're going to move the child. Same way when I look at digital child trafficking, live streaming, as people will refer to it, the image of that child is moving across borders and it's being exploited across borders. There's some countries in the world that are making massive amounts of money in local communities because the need is there. So then it becomes organized within small villages, it becomes organized within small communities. So there is that organized element, the ad hoc, and then organized criminal enterprise. It's a
That's
very
so
tough topic.
Yeah, that's so
Sorry.
much darker than I was expecting. I don't know why. But I appreciate you clarifying it. I know, and we're running out of time, but I did want to ask kind of like a weird uh I don't know if it's tangential, but I have seen news lately about police and legislation in certain areas trying to grapple with AI generated synthetic images of child exploitation. And I wonder how you're engaging with that because earlier you were emphasizing like it has to be victim centric, our approach.
Mm.
And then in this case, in theory, there's no particular victim. So like, are you, how is ICMEC engaging with that issue?
Yeah, so we have the Safer AI for Children Coalition in Australia, which is a lot of not-for-profits looking at the impact of AI. And when we look at self-generated sorry, not self-generated, AI-generated material, Gen AI material, it's just as bad as actually having a real victim of child sexual exploitation, because what's happening is you are using material to actually help people overcome their cognitive barrier in relation to sexual exploitation of children. And that actually starts the paradigm of escalation in offending. This has been brought out by a number of different journals. So I look at Dr. Michael Burke and Dr. Joe Sullivan, they will talk about people overcoming the conscious barrier, and they're using certain material to help them overcome the conscious barrier. The flip side of that is the very small resources we use for victim ID within law enforcement. They're getting sucked in relation to this AI generated material that's of sexual exploitation, thinking it's a real victim of child sexual abuse, using resources to try and identify this victim. And those resources are very, very tiny. Like a victim ID specialist is nearly worth their weight in gold. And they're using those resources to try and identify a victim that was never there in the first place. So it goes back to when we look at the operation of AI about risk. So accepted risk, unacceptable risk, and high risk. This is where we start looking at technology service providers when they're developing this technology. Can it be used for adverse or perverted purposes in relation to generating images that have no safeguard rails around it, that have nothing in place to actually prevent it from being used to actually create sexualized images of children?
Like, look, just thinking back at the question I just asked, I'm like, what a world. AI has
Yeah.
moved so quickly. I don't know that I could have predicted we would be having this conversation even like a couple years ago.
I think that's why it's important to actually look at law. Is that law, we need to be agile. We need to actually get it in place so that we actually provide opportunity for innovation, but at the same time, guardrails to actually prevent the exploitation of technology.
Mhm.
Yeah.
You're here. Tony, do you have anything else you want to get in there before we wrap up?
No, just if there are like what can we do as like people, the average person do to kind of better educate ourselves on what's going on? Are there like ways that people can help ICMEC with what they do or raise awareness? I mean,
It'd be wrong for me not to actually say that we're a not-for-profit organization and we accept any donations or any funding opportunities, because it allows us to run programs like education programs for law enforcement. So when a young person goes up to a police station in Australia, they will actually get the proper support and materials to help them actually deal with that instance. Because again, very emotional time for a victim of sextortion or for child abuse. They need to actually, their first contact is a really important part. So we're rolling out those type of education programs. Um, it's actually a good time because the 11th of February is Safer Internet Day, and definitely for Australians and for other people around the world, there's a number of resources there for people to use to actually find themselves as being safe online. The one thing I always say to people is, if you have a young person or you're talking to a person, is have that conversation about being safe online, making sure that they talk to people that they know. Um, don't engage in behaviors that would actually compromise your own safety. And we have seen this so many times in relation to the sextortion taking place online and young people then committing suicide as a result of being blackmailed and being basically pressured into a moment of despair. Have that conversation with your young people. Look at the safety tips online, especially from the eSafety Commission Australia, from safe online organisations within across the globe, and just to use those results. But if you'd like to talk to us at ICMEC, icmec.org.au, we're more than happy to actually have a conversation with you.
Lindsay, thank you. We'll include any links in the description to the episode so people can get in touch.
Colm, this was such a important conversation, and it's very serious, and we really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us.
Thank you both for your time and the opportunity to speak with you. And I love the podcast, by the way.